This is the fourth book and the last book in the Raina series, and it is titled Storms. So, Book 4, Part 1, Chapter 1. I stared at my dad, his words still echoing in my ears. I told you I would come for you. Phil, I whispered, and then turned and looked down the small hallway at the other end of the plane's cabin. I went to stand and frowned, looking down at my waist. When I reached for the large strap that held me in place, my dad shook his head. Not just yet. Vampires didn't wear seatbelts, my mind told me, even though I had been wearing them a lot in the last hour. First in the car, as we were knocked around the road by some unseen assailant, and now as I sat in my dad's private plane. My mind was still numb from all that had happened. I couldn't process all of it yet. Phil was in the back room with the others. "Rock," I gasped, still blinking more than I needed to. The belt clicked as I yanked it off and went to stand. Jonathan undid his, and I felt and knelt in front of me, gently taking my arms and keeping me in the chair. "You have to sit still until we are up." I looked into the gray eyes that smiled at me, and my throat tightened. My own reflection stared back at me, but I looked past them and inhaled slowly. Under the tart smell of gasoline and the metallic scent of blood was Jonathan. "My Jonathan," I whispered, and his smile grew. He was wearing a blue t-shirt now, but the image of him shirtless sent a ripple of warmth through my body. "Yes, love," he whispered back, now taking the chair next to me. I turned, keeping my eyes locked on his, a desperation rushing through me. I wanted to turn back time, to be sitting on my couch at the manor, or bent over the air hockey table glaring at my opponent. I remembered standing at my bedroom window, longing for excitement. My life was so boring and predictable back then, and I hated it with a passion. Well, the bored part, that is. The tree line on the horizon had taunted me. I didn't complain much, but I was so hungry for something to happen. Now, here I was, wishing I was back there. Boring seemed like paradise. There was a dinging sound somewhere, but my eyes were clinging to the gray ones across from me, while the images swam through my mind. My brain tried to will it to happen, and my jaw clenched from the effort. Just then another face appeared, and I turned, seeing Phil kneeling in front of me. I frowned and reached out, wiping at the dirt that was smeared across his face. "They're gonna be okay," he smiled, and my heart reached for his. "She's in shock," Jonathan stated, his voice sounding hard. Phil's lip twitched, but he chuckled when I wiped his other cheek, only succeeding in smearing it more. His dirty blonde hair was more dirty than blonde right now, and I wondered if we packed the shampoo. "You need a shower," I whispered, visually inspecting his face. He smiled and took my hand, kissing the palm. "I guess I do." Why did everything seem so odd? My mind blurred, all my thoughts, and I peered at him, trying to sort them out. I hadn't forgotten like before. I just couldn't seem to hold on to one thought long enough to process it all the way through. "Tay." I blinked and then smiled. "I'm okay," I whispered, moving his hair out of his face. My wolf was here, smiling at me, and he was safe. Someone cleared their throat, and I turned. "Jonathan." My stomach tightened and I sat back, then looked over at my dad. In the middle of this very strange situation, my dad's eyes sparkled and he winked. For some bizarre reason, that made me giggle. I gasped and put a hand over my mouth, but then started to laugh. My dad's eyes widened and I laughed harder, shaking my head and putting both hands over my mouth to try to stop it. "Get the doctor," Jonathan hissed. "He's kind of busy," Phil snapped back. My laugh slowed a bit, but I still couldn't stop. What was wrong with me? There was absolutely nothing funny about any of this, but I couldn't help it. I giggled through my hands. "Tay, take a deep breath," Phil stated, sitting up and blocking my view to my dad. I nodded and moved my hand, still giggling. "Breathe in slow," he whispered, putting his hands on my knees. I nodded again and gulped in some air. "Slow," he cooed, and then I hiccuped. Oh, great. He chuckled and rubbed one of my knees. "It's okay, it's just shock." "Enough," came a voice so full of tight anger that my hiccups stopped. My smile fell, and I turned to see Jonathan glaring at Phil. I felt my hackles rise, and Phil turned, lowering his jaw and meeting the gray eyes as a low growl started. "Musk it down," came another hard voice, and I looked up to see Ryan standing there. He looked like he had just crawled through a forest, on his stomach, for a very long time. My dad stood up then, and I flinched, expecting the two of them to face off now. Instead, my dad nodded. "That's the last thing she needs right now." I frowned, more out of surprise than anything. "You all need a shower," I stated, looking them over. Wow, yeah, that was a profound spat of wisdom. I sighed and looked down at my hands, noticing they were shaking a little. The scent of Phil's musk was thick now. My dad and Jonathan couldn't smell it, but Ryan's low, deep growl told Phil to put it in check. My back stiffened in response. "Let's get one thing straight right now," my dad stated, and I was the only one that looked up at him. Phil and Jonathan were both looking at me, and the sensation was a cross between nausea and an adrenaline rush. "You two will stand down, or I will put you both off at the first stop." The two guys flinched a bit, but neither moved. Finally, after another low growl, so low that the two vampires didn't catch it, Phil stood. He stayed directly in front of me, but he turned and nodded to my dad. I moved my leg forward just a bit, giving him support through my touch. I felt his anger slow, and he moved back against me. A door opened, and I turned, avoiding Jonathan's look as I did. Track walked out, wiping his hands on a towel, although the rest of him was just as filthy as the others. More so, I thought as he stepped up, and even more so, I thought as he stepped up and surveyed the situation quietly. How are they?" I asked quietly. "Been better," he shrugged, but winked at me. "They're tough, though." I stood, coming nearly chest to chest with Phil. His scent filled me, and with it came a slew of emotions. Some were mine, others were his. I smiled at him to comfort some of those, and then stepped around him, feeling myself get a little stronger. "Can I go?" Track, my dad, and Ryan all shook their heads, and I sighed, but was actually a bit relieved. Cal had been unconscious when Track had carried him on board, and there was so much blood. Rock had been leaning on Jackson, and I hadn't seen how bad Aaron and Marcus were, but was sure they were just as bad. I didn't know if I was ready to handle that. How selfish was I? It also felt good to step out of the line of fire between my wolf and him, I thought, and shivered. I moved closer to the other three, and my dad took my hand. When I winced, he frowned and lifted it. "Want to tell me about this now?" he asked, trying to put a smile in his words. "Not really," I shrugged, biting my lip. "Just me being careless as always." He sighed and nodded. "We only have the one doctor, and he's a bit busy, but as soon I'll take a look at it." We turned to see Michael step up. What didn't that man know how to do? I followed him to a leather couch that was anchored to the wall of the plane. I sat down and he sat in front of me. I leaned forward a bit and inhaled, smiling. "Sniffing me?" he chuckled as he started to unwrap my bandage. "You smell like home," I whispered. His hands stopped for a split second and he blinked hard as he continued. I yelped when he felt a certain spot and then put my good hand up when Track rushed over. "Just tender," I stated. My best friend nodded and sat behind me. I leaned back against him and we watched Michael inspect my arm. "You know," my bodyguard stated quietly, "a bone needs rest to heal properly." He chuckled and then smiled at me. "It's healing fine, but you need to actually take care of it and let it." I giggled a bit. Man, it was good sitting here looking at him. Michael had been my bodyguard since I was little. I wondered how hard it was on his ego to get such a post. He was crazy smart, amazingly physical, and yet he was a glorified babysitter, if there was any glory to it. "Verdict?" came my dad's voice, and I noticed he had walked over. "This splint is actually pretty amazing," Michael stated, holding up the formed plastic. "It holds the arm at just the right angle, but allows it to flex and keeps it from holding it so tight that another impact would shatter the bone." Then he smiles. "Seems someone knew she needed that." "Hey," I shot out, but with a smile. "It needs to be cleaned up, and a new bandage. That one smells." Track growled, but Michael ignored it. "Other than that, she needs to be strapped to a chair and forced to sit still and let it heal." My eyes lifted. "That can be arranged." My eyes widened more and I looked at my dad. He grinned and shook a finger at me. "If that's what it takes." "You wouldn't." "I would," Track chuckled behind me, and I elbowed him with my good arm. This almost felt like old times, minus, well, everything else. I groaned and turned. Are they really going to be okay? My alpha stepped up now, Phil moving over to a sink where Martin was filling a ceramic bowl with water. "We might have to strap all of you down to heal," he smiled. "But yes, they're going to be okay." Cal was... My nose tingled as the image popped back into my head. There was blood. So much. Ryan knelt and my eyes followed him. He took it hard, he stated, his own brown eyes showing the concern he wouldn't let out in his words. "Luckily, like the rest of these musks, he has a very thick skull." I smiled and nodded. I needed to hear that. "How bad are Aaron and Marcus?" I asked, and Ryan looked at me hard, his eyebrows tight. I shrugged. "I didn't see when you brought them in, but you said they would all be okay, right?" Phil brought over the bowl, and Jonathan dropped some washcloths and a first aid kit on the table. I flinched, feeling the tension. This was going to be an interesting plane ride. Ryan cleared his throat and stood. Michael washed my arm up and then actually let me sit with it on the towel and air dry. It felt good to be out of that splint, even for the few minutes he allowed. There are 2 showers, my dad stated, looking at Ryan. One in the master room and another along the hallway. As for clothes, we brought our bags, Ryan replied, and then turned. Jonathan, Phil, why don't you boys go freshen up first? They both looked shocked, but my dad nodded and turned, telling one of the workers to get their bags. Phil took a step towards me, but Ryan's eyes stopped him. He frowned, glanced at me, and then turned and walked down the hallway. Jonathan lingered until my father also gave him a look, and then he was gone too. I let out my breath and leaned back against track again. I know vampires don't musk, he said, careful to keep his voice down, but that was as close to it as I ever thought possible. When I nodded, he sighed hard. This is going to be a very long ride. Where are we going anyhow? I asked, first looking at Michael and then up at my dad. Yeah, Michael wouldn't tell me unless my dad okayed it. Oliver's place, my dad stated, and I rolled my eyes. Well, that narrowed it down. I didn't even know who Oliver was. Is there a reason I can't know? I mean, seriously, what's the big deal? Maybe it's a surprise, my dad grinned, and I tilted my head. Michael finally put my splint back on, and then he headed towards the cockpit. I sat back on the couch, Track now sitting next to me, with his ankles crossed on the floor in front of him. What happened back there? I whispered, my voice shaking a bit. My dad and Ryan both turned and looked at me. They were several feet away, but they had heard. Crazy nut jobs chased us. Jackson's driving skills and your dad saved us, and now we're all headed on a nice little vacation. He sighed with his eyes closed and his arms crossed over his chest. Translation? I can't tell you. I looked down at my splint and picked at the bandage. Guilt swam over me. I was glad he hadn't told me. I had asked, but I knew I didn't want to hear the answer. I bit my lower lip. Again, the Amazon warrior became the scared little girl. I was such a wimp. Jonathan was the first to walk back into the main area. My mind flashed to him without his shirt on, and I looked down at my lap. When Phil showed up, he walked straight over and sat between me and Track. The tension spiked again, and I suddenly seemed very interested in the pattern on my pants. Jeans don't really have patterns, but I was suddenly determined to find ones in the threads. I'll take the first watch, Ryan stated, and I looked over at him. He was talking to my dad. My dad nodded and stepped up to me. Why don't you go lay down in the master room? Watch a movie. Relax. Translation, let's get you out of the room and hope these two don't try to kill each other. He held out his hand to point out that it really wasn't a question. As he pulled me from the wolf sandwich, I turned and looked at Phil. He winked and gave me a small nod. We both knew what was going on, and neither of us liked it. When Track jumped up and stood next to me, my dad chuckled but turned and walked me down the hallway. I felt the eyes behind me, but didn't look back. My stomach was nodding, and my heart felt like it was in a taffy pull. I had seen one on TV, and the image fit. The master room was large and quiet. It had a sitting area with 2 plush chairs and a small table, all anchored to the floor. There was a king-size bed and a huge plasma TV that slid down when my dad hit the button. When he and I flew, it was my room. He didn't need to sleep as much as I did. When I was on my way to see him or home from a visit with him, it was still my room. "Hungry?" he asked as he moved to one of his fancy duffel bags that was nestled into the railed top of a dresser made of dark wood. Everything in here was cream except the wood, and the bedding, that was different, but complementing shades of browns. It was elegant, but also familiar. I said no at the same time Track said yes. I shrugged and my dad's brows lowered. "She doesn't feed anymore," Track stated, casually taking the remote that my dad held out to him. "At all?" There was more worry in his response. There was more than worry in his response. He seemed angry. "She inhales food on 4 legs, Track stated without laughing. "Seems she gets enough then to keep her full." He shrugged to show he didn't understand it any more than that. When I looked at my dad, he smiled. "Well then." Then he paused, his closed clutched in one hand. I noticed the white knuckles as he nearly squeezed the life out of his shirt. "Dad, It's gonna be okay, sweetheart," he smiled, then kissed the top of my head and walked towards the bathroom. "Well, I can't flop on the bed like this," Track chuckled, looking down at himself. "Why don't you go take a shower?" "After he's done, if there's any hot water left." When I shrugged to show I didn't know the answer, he sighed. "Well then." He plopped in one of the chairs and turned to face the TV. "Let's see what kind of reception you get in the clouds." I growled at him and tried to snatch the remote when he wouldn't settle on any one channel. He held it behind his head and shook a finger at me. You're supposed to be resting that arm." I rolled my eyes and he chuckled, flipping through a few more channels. I ignored it at first, letting the images blur without seeing them. Phil was in the other room, and he was upset. I could sense that, and it consumed me. "Thought you were going to watch TV," Track chuckled after several minutes. "You're making me dizzy," I huffed, wincing at the screen. How could he even tell what he was looking at? "Not hard to do at this height," he chuckled, and then yelped when my foot found his shin. I tried to focus on the TV, wanting desperately to push all other things out, but my mind kept wandering. First to Phil. I missed him. Even though he was just down the hall, I knew our current situation was going to make things hard. Then about the 4 wounded wolves in the other room. I would go and visit them as soon as they allowed me to. "Ooh, now here is something," he stated, and I looked up to see a bunch of girls in bikinis dancing around a pool. "No way," I snorted, then lunged forward, intent on getting that remote. He leaned back further, and I reached over his head, trying to grab it. Track twisted, and I started to slip. So I did what anyone in my position would have done. I took him down with me. We landed with a thud on the thick rug, him on top of me, and his arm still up in the air. "Problems?" My eyes widened, and I craned my neck to see my dad standing over us. I groaned and then shoved Track hard. He fell back into a sitting position, one of his legs still over me. He chuckled and stood, pulling me up with him. "Raina," my dad sighed, and I nodded. I know. You've got to be more careful." When he nodded, I sighed, and then my dad looked up at the screen, quickly realizing what probably started the wrestling match. He chuckled, and I saw the same look on his face. It was kind of like being back home. "Can Track take a shower now?" I asked, then wrinkled my nose. "He stinks." "Hey," my best friend gasped, trying to act offended. My dad chuckled and nodded. "There's plenty of hot water. Enjoy," he said, glancing at Track. "Is there a TV in there?" he asked, and then jumped out of the way when I took a swing at him. He wiggled his brows and then looked at the door. "I have to get my bag." "I'll get it for you," I said, smiling. He frowned. I shrugged innocently, and he finally nodded, giving me a warning look, and headed into the bathroom. I yanked the remote from the chair and clicked the TV off. Boys. My dad laughed then, and I smiled. I loved hearing him laugh. When he stepped up, I wrapped my arms around his waist and inhaled him deeply. "I missed you so much, Daddy." "I missed you too, sweetheart," he whispered, stroking my hair. There was a knock at the door, and I stiffened. He chuckled and called out. "Everything all right in here, sir?" Martin asked, looking around. I giggled, and my dad nodded. Martin nodded back and left the room. "I better get Track's bag for him," I grinned, and my dad shook his head. "You look like you're up to something." When I opened my mouth, he shook his head. "I like seeing you smile, and whatever it is, I probably don't want to know." I gave him another hug, and we both left the room. I stopped at the door that led to where the other four were recovering. "Not just yet," my dad whispered. I put my hand on the door to send them my silent support, and then moved down the door to the door that held our bags. "Once you take his bag in," my dad whispered, looking down the rest of the way, "I want you to stay in the master bedroom." He wasn't going to get any argument out of me there, and I really wasn't ready to have the debate with him about Phil. So I did like any chicken would. I nodded and walked into the small room while he continued down the hallway. I was sitting on the big bed when I heard the shower turn off. I bit my lower lip and giggled, perking my ears up. Hey, he had it coming. A minute passed, and then another, and I frowned at the door. He should have noticed by now. I had taken all of his boxers out of his bag and put the hot pink pair of underwear in. It still had the tags on it. When another minute passed, I tilted my head, and then my eyes widened when he walked out with just a towel around his waist and the under thing dangling from one of his hands. Why didn't pranks ever go well when I tried them? "So, did you want me to wear these, or were you giving them to me as a souvenir?" he chuckled, twirling them on one finger. I moaned, and he shook his head. "You suck at pranks. You always have." He walked over to the other bag that was sitting on the floor and opened it. Wow, that was so not how that played out in my mind. When he stood up, he had the pink panties tucked into the waist of the towel and a pair of his boxers in his hand. "Whatever," I huffed and looked back at the TV. "Aw, did you want them back?" he teased, walking over and standing at the end of the bed, blocking part of the TV. I sat up on my knees. "No, you bought them. You can wear them," I shot back. He pulled them out and tucked them under his arm, then held up the bright underwear. "I think I'm more of a neon blue kind of guy. Pink might make me look..." Then the door opened, and we both turned. Michael looked at Track, who still had the panties held up in front of him. My best friend shrugged and shot them at me like a rubber band, but didn't say anything. What was there to say? Michael blinked hard and looked at me. All I could do was shrug. He had walked in on much more awkward situations, and they were always innocent once you heard the whole story. Dinner is ready, he said in a hard tone. But he didn't turn and leave. In fact, he stepped in the room and crossed his arms. Track nodded, pulled the boxers out from under his arm. I'll be right there, he stated, winked at me, and trotted back into the bathroom, shutting the door behind him. I saw Michael look down at the bed, and I snatched the gaudy garment and balled it up, hiding it in my fist. When he still didn't move, I shrugged. Long story. It usually is with you two, he stated, but I saw the smile in his eyes. My dad's head popped in the door, and he looked at me and then at Michael. Everything okay? I nodded, and Michael shrugged his massive shoulders. I walked in on Track in nothing but a towel, holding a pair of hot pink female underwear, and Raina sitting on the bed watching. He shrugged again. Nothing out of the ordinary here. I huffed, but my dad laughed. Pink underwear? My dad stepped in, and Jonathan smiled at me from the doorway. My heart instantly started to beat faster than it should. I blinked several times, not able to look away from him this time. I wanted to walk over to him, wrap my arms around his neck, and kiss his amazingly soft lips. I remembered the feel of them against mine, and I had to force my hands to stay at my side. I shook my head hard. What was wrong with me now? I growled low and lowered my eyes. I won't ask, he chuckled, and then looked over my head. She was helping me decide what to wear, Track snapped, the playful response dripping with musk as he walked out. I hope you opted for something less pink, my dad chuckled, and I pushed my hand quickly behind my back, which caused Jonathan's brows to lift a little. Then, to my surprise, my dad left. I swallowed hard. He wasn't really going to leave me in here with him, was he? Where was Phil? I wanted Phil. With my dad out of the room, Track got braver and leaned over the bed. He acted like he was going to whisper something in my ear, and because of the situation, I fell for it. He snatched the underwear out of my hand, swinging it a bit. I'll just keep these in my bag. Good memories there, he chuckled, pretending to try to whisper. I looked at him like he had lost his mind, then turned to see the two vampires glaring past me, both jaws tight. It's not, I tried, quickly getting off the bed. Track bought me, I had some and lost. Well, I bit my lower lip and Track chuckled, putting a hand around my waist. It's okay. I won't tell them. Then he walked right past my bodyguard and Jonathan and headed down the hall. What in the world, I thought, my eyes wide as I stood there. Chapter 2. Awkward. I shifted my eyes and looked down at my feet. Michael chuckled but didn't move. Jonathan took a step in the room, but my bodyguard stopped him with a look. Is this how the whole flight was going to be? Probably, I thought, and sighed at my shoes. Then I heard a door open behind me, and I leaned over. When I saw the doctor come out of the other room, I pushed past both of them and followed him out into the main cabin where everyone turned. Phil frowned, seeing Jonathan walking behind me, but I barely noticed. My eyes were focused on the doctor. I noticed he wasn't one of my doctors from the manor and looked at my dad. When the room went quiet, I huffed. What? I just want to know how they're doing. Really, what was so wrong about that? The doctor, however, looked at my dad. Look, those four are my friends, my pack, I growled. Well, Cal and Aaron are owl saws, I shrugged. But after what we went through, they might as well be. Still no one spoke, but eyes shifted around. I looked at the doctor and raised my brows, waiting. He looked at my dad again and then cleared his throat when my dad gave him a hard look and a slow nod that said more than I could figure out. What was it with guys and that secret eye talk? Well, the man that looked too young to be a doctor said, they're doing well. He sighed and went to turn. I gave a sarcastic laugh, stepped up to him, blocking him from moving. Not good enough. Tay, Phil tried, taking a step towards me, but Ryan shook his head. What's the problem? I hissed, then looked at Track, wanting to see his eyes. They said they're gonna be okay. When he nodded, I shrugged. So, why are you all acting like they're not? I turned and looked over my shoulder. What aren't you telling me? Guess I will go see for myself then, I stated, and didn't jump when Track blocked my way. They are sedated, the doctor said, and I turned back around. But they will be okay? When he nodded, I glanced around the room at the faces, skipping quickly over Jonathan's and even Phil's. It was too hard to concentrate when I looked at either one of them. So, why all the... 'Cause we never know what's going to set you off, Track chuckled, and I turned on him. He shrugged, leaning over and scooping up a plate piled high with food. I blinked, wondering where all that came from, and he leaned forward. You are a bit jumpy at times. Am not, I huffed, but without any real bite. Wow. Did I really have everyone this nervous about telling me anything? More memories swam by to make their point, and I sighed, turning back to the doctor. So, they're really going to be okay? As stated, Miss Blvd, he frowned, when Track coughed a laugh. I have seen to their injuries and given them something to help with the pain. It will allow them to sleep, which will aid in the healing. When I stared at him, he shrugged. Nothing that time and rest won't fix. I peered at him harder, and my dad walked into my line of view. You are not to bother them either, he stated with a smile. You may not listen when it comes to your own recovery, but you will listen when it comes to theirs. Track bumped my shoulder with his. Come on, Wolf Girl. Let's go watch some TV. I think that spring break show is still on. Spring break, Jackson hollered, standing up from the table and grabbing his own plate. I'm in. I rolled my eyes. We are not watching that. As the three of us headed back down the hall, I noticed how quiet it was behind us. They were waiting to talk until I was out of earshot. Nothing new there, I hissed under my breath, then stopped in front of the other bedroom door again, my heart sad for what they were going through. Hey, food's getting cold, Jackson teased, and I nodded and continued into the bedroom. Any idea where we're headed or why? I asked as I watched them consume the massive plates of food. Where had it all come from? I remembered the boxes that I saw being loaded onto the plane, but this was hot food, and there was lots of it. No more than you, Jackson stated between bites. I flinched. He really needed to work on his table manners. The smell of the food filled the room, and my calves started to tingle. I looked down at them, and this time I didn't growl. Track's eyes followed mine. "Wolf hungry?" he chuckled, setting his food on his plate and thankfully wiping his hands on a napkin. A few minutes later, I had my muzzle deep in a large bowl and was consuming the food with a passion. It was delicious. I looked up at Track and Jackson and licked my nose. "Hey, just because you didn't bother to chew yours," Jackson snapped playfully and put his arms protectively around his plate. I lowered my front half a bit and pulled back my teeth, letting the growls stay low. "Nope, my food," he stated, shaking his head while he crammed a piece of meat in his mouth. I wasn't really all that hungry now, but the game was fun. I barked, jumping forward on my front paws, then winced and held my sore one up. The door flew open, and I think my dad and Michael actually collided, trying to squeeze through at the same time. She shifted. "Duh," I barked at my dad, who knelt down and lifted my paw. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, directing his question behind him. "She does it quicker now," Track shrugged. "We've gotten so used to it that—" He shrugged again. "It's just a natural thing now." "Except when she gets too stressed," Jackson put in. Track nodded. "True. Surprised she didn't shift in the rig back there." My dad sighed and Track bent down. "I put the bandage back on her leg, but the splint doesn't fit." I gave a happy bark at my dad and nuzzled his chest. Track was right. The pain was tolerable now, and it was just something I did. Then the doctor walked in, and I growled. "Come on," Jackson sighed, moving away from his prized plate. "She doesn't need to be poked and prodded anymore. Seriously, it's just—" "I'll decide what's necessary for my daughter," my dad snapped, and I lowered my head. Jackson plopped back down and crossed his arms hard over his chest, his food now forgotten. Ryan walked in then, and Jonathan and Phil seemed to take advantage and joined us. The doctors left the room, and I sat down, relieved, until my dad explained that he went to get his bag. "Ryan, we tried to tell him they don't need to put her under the scope every time she shifts," Jackson snapped, but avoided looking at my dad, who was still kneeling in front of me. Ryan cleared his throat, and Jackson huffed and turned back to his plate, but shot me a look that said he had my back if needed. I barked at him and let my tail hit the rug to let him know it was okay. When the new doctor walked back in, he knelt next to my dad and smiled at me. I have never seen a pure black wolf. His bag was more like a mini lab. It was silver-colored, shiny, and about 1.5 feet high. I watched him open the top and then hinge the corners that swung outward. Then, unlike the other stuffy doctors that drooled over me like an experiment, this doctor sat down, all the way down, and looked at me. I tilted my head, and my dad moved back just a little. "My name is Dr. John Alexander," he stated, and then put out his hand, palm up. I tilted my head the other way and lifted my injured paw, laying it over his hand. "First, I just want to take a look at this. Your friend wrapped it nicely, though, so I will just have a peek." The room went quiet. My dad smiled at me when I looked at him, and then Phil knelt and put his hand on the back of my neck. I turned and nuzzled him as the doctor felt my leg. It's a bit warm, a little swollen, but nothing we wouldn't expect, he stated. And the odd thing was, he was actually talking to me. The other doctors had treated me more like a project than a person. I gave a small whine when he touched a tender spot, and he looked up, but my tongue flopped out of my mouth. I liked him. I think I'll put some ointment on it, just to ease the pain. He turned to his bag and showed me a tube. I sniffed it and snorted. He chuckled. Yeah, I did like him. You should put some ice on this, too. It will get that heat and swelling down faster. Trax said something, and Jackson jumped up and left the room. He put a light in my eyes, looked in my ears, and then in my mouth. He felt my throat and listened to my heart and talked to me the whole time. And not like a child either. If he wasn't explaining what he was doing, he was commenting on it. Nice strong heart, he said, putting the stethoscope away. Your stomach is making a lot of noise, he chuckled, but that's just your dinner settling. Then he started to put the rest of his things away. I looked at Phil, and he shrugged to show me he was just as surprised. No needles? The other doctors poked me every chance they got, and whined when they couldn't. My brows knit. It almost felt like a trick. She's wondering why you aren't pulling out the needles, my dad chuckled, and I barked at him for bringing it up. Well, Dr. John, as I already decided to call him, shrugged. I guess I could, if you want. He was playing with me. I barked and lowered my head in a playful threat, but my flapping tail gave it away. He closed up the case and nodded. I'm not going to lie. I will need to take some blood at some point. Then he shocked me by winking. But I think you've been through enough now. Don't you? I couldn't even respond. With that, he stood, and my dad did too. Phil rubbed my back, and I let out a happy sound that was similar to a whine if you weren't a wolf. He chuckled and laid his forehead on my now massive one. Can I shift? Jackson asked as he walked back in with a bag of ice. No came from so many directions I wasn't sure who said it first. He flinched and held up his hands. Fine, dang. Then he tossed Phil the ice pack. Jonathan caught it in mid-air, and my tongue went back in my mouth fast. Here we go again. But Phil's smile widened, and his eyes turned back to me. Let's find you a place to lay down and ice that leg, he stated calmly. Finally, after they laid towels on the bed, I hopped up on it and laid down on my stomach. Jonathan walked over and sat next to me now. Okay, this was getting out of hand. He laid the ice pack over my paw, and I sniffed it. The cold actually felt good, and it took some of the heat out of my leg immediately. That was pretty amazing. This should have been iced the whole time, Jonathan stated, pretending to be talking to me and doing a very poor job of it. Yeah, well, it's kind of hard to get ice in the woods, Jackson snapped. I moaned. That really wasn't helping. I'm sure, was all Jonathan said, adjusting the pack. That awkward silence rippled through the room, and I snorted as the musk levels nearly shot through the roof. I pawed at my nose with my good leg, and Ryan sighed. Yeah, I know. This was going to be a very long flight. Let's let her rest now, my dad stated, gesturing towards the door. When no one moved, he sighed, looking at Ryan. Sheesh. Fine. They could all stay here, and I'll leave, I thought. The tension was so thick, I would just go hide in the bathroom. This one was much bigger than the one at the hotel. There was plenty of room. Track can stay, my dad finally stated in a firm tone. The rest of you? He again gestured to the door. Jonathan leaned over and kissed the top of my head. I promised to never leave you, and I meant it, he whispered in my ear. My eyes opened wide and he winked, then stood and followed the others out of the room. My dad looked at Ryan, who nodded as they left. Keep her still, my dad stated, looking at Track as he walked out. Then the door shut. Man, Track whistled as he walked over and flopped on the bed next to me. He was on his back, with his head by mine. You sure know how to stir the pot, don't you? Me? I thought. I didn't do this. He smiled and looked up at the ceiling. You didn't, but... He gave a low whistle. Yeah, I had to agree with that one. I put my head on my good leg and sighed. What in the world was I going to do? A few minutes later I yawned and he turned his head, his hands tucked behind it. Bored already? He smiled. What am I going to do, Track? He shook his head. I can't answer that for you. But he put up his finger and I went quiet as he rolled onto his side. I lifted my head and watched him. First of all, keep in mind that I am not the only one that can hear you, he almost whispered, then looked towards the door. I swallowed hard and he nodded. Second of all, well, like I said, I have no idea. My head tilted and he shrugged. I love Phil. He's pack and click, he sighed. Jonathan's not all bad. My brows lifted higher. They're both getting on my nerves, though. Or they do when they get fixated on you. My head shot up and he chuckled. Jealousy? Yeah, probably, but not in some freaky way. He looked at me and his eyes softened. Ray, you're my best friend. Serious best friend. I nuzzled him and he put his hand on my back. They both tick me off when they go too far with you, he winced. I mean when they push the lines. He rolled his eyes and flopped back on his back. You need to make up your own mind. I'll kick whoever's butt treats you wrong and back up whatever you decide. Wow. I sat there looking down at him in amazement. I had completely expected him to lay into me for even having to ask. I loved Phil. Our love was special. It was aote, he whispered, and I snorted again. No, I didn't hear you say it. Best friends thing, remember? I stretched out my neck and laid my head on his bent arm, my cheek up against his. I loved Phil. He was my soulmate, my other half. I decided that it was just the shock of seeing Jonathan and the guilt that had my mind spinning. Either that, or I was a monster. It always came back to that. Go to sleep, Ray. There'll be plenty of time to drive yourself crazy later. He chuckled when I snorted and closed my eyes. I inched my body closer to him, and he did the same. I swear I had only just closed my eyes when I felt Track move. Ray, he whispered, and I blinked one eye open. Time to get up. Plus, my arm's asleep. I dragged my head off his limb and closed my eyes. We'd just lie down, I thought, so he could hear me. I'm tired. And I was. I don't know if it was the altitude, the stress, or something else, but I was exhausted. We're about to land. That got my attention, and I looked up to see Michael standing there. Already? I barked. Refueling, my bodyguard stated. I knew he couldn't hear me. Phil, Track, and Jonathan were the only ones that could, although we never did find out how that was even possible. In wolf forms, all wolves could communicate to a point, but they could hear me no matter what form I was in. Unfortunately, it didn't go both ways. I could hear Phil and Track when we were shifted. Even then, Pack thought was different. It wasn't words. It was sounds, smells, feelings, translated and passed from one wolf to the other. I lifted my head enough to yawn and then laid back down. So what? Track chuckled and shoved me a bit so he could sit up. Don't you want to stretch your legs? Again, I looked up at Michael. Was he serious? I barked and sat up. He shrugged. Your dad owns the strip. There's a large hangar, and he thought you could use a nice walk, he stated, lowering his chin to get the warning across. The ice was now a bag of water, and I put my paw down on the bed to test it. It did feel much better. I jumped down off the bed just as Track was yelling at me not to. I winced and pulled up my leg. Okay, that hurt. You never listen, do you? He snapped, kneeling and taking my leg. It's fine, I snorted and snatched it back, setting it carefully on the rug. Stay low. We'll be landing in a minute, Michael stated, and then chuckled. After he left, Track looked around. How are we going to buckle you in for that? Excuse me? Don't you have to? He said to stay low. I will lay down on the rug and should be just fine. You, however, should sit down and buckle up. I used my chin to point to a chair. It has a belt in it. Track plopped in the seat and fastened the buckle over his waist. I flattened myself on the rug and hoped this is really what Michael meant. The landing was smooth, and I was scratching at the door while Track undid his restraint. Hang on, he fussed and turned the handle. I burst out of the room, but my leg quickly slowed me to a fast walk. Don't limp, I told myself, or they'll never let you out. I forced myself to walk normally and stepped out into the main cabin. I noticed the hatch was open, but there was something dark over it. I knew the night tube well enough. It's how vampires got on and off planes when the sun was out. It wasn't always possible to hop on a plane at night and still have it be night where you landed. The tube was large and was just that, a tube. It encircled the stairs and led either to a waiting closed car, another plane, or now it seemed to an airplane bunker thing. Must be a long tube, since I was pretty sure we couldn't land right next to one, no matter how skilled Lonnie was. Closed car will drive us into the hangar, my dad explained. Oh, hangar, not bunker. I shrugged, not caring what it was called. I had been cooped up for too long. First for days in a log cabin, then hotel to hotel. I tilted my head as the others gathered in groups. Actually, longer than that. When my dad shipped me off, first to Jonathan's and then to Aunt Mary's, I was sequestered there too. I grunted and headed towards the hatch. Easy there, Phil stated, stepping up so his leg touched my side. Can you handle the steps? I looked up at him, and he gave me that look that said, don't try to act tough with me. Walking with a healing broken arm wasn't any big deal on 2 feet. But in wolf form, with the stairs? I'll be fine. I just have to take it slow. I added the last part so that I would appear honest and cautious. It worked, because Phil nodded and stepped up to the tube. My dad was halfway down the stairs waiting. I saw Michael just past him and groaned. "Want me to carry you?" Jackson chuckled, and I nipped at his leg. "Here, this should help." We all turned, and Dr. John rushed over and knelt in front of me. He held out his hand, and I put my paw on it. "I worked on this while you slept," he stated, unwrapping the light brown bandage. Then he held up something that looked like a foam pipe. I sniffed at it, and he showed me a slit down one side and opened it. Much like the plastic one, this one should hold the bone without constricting it, but the foam should allow you more range of motion and still have a good deal of support. That was pretty cool. He slipped it over my leg and nodded. "Not a bad fit, if I do say so myself." He chuckled and then wrapped it with the bandage. "It only covers the forelegs, so you can bend at the knee." He waited, and I lifted my leg so that it bent. Just a bit too long. He went to reach for it, but I gave a happy bark and headed towards the tube. "A bit eager?" the doctor smiled as he stood. "She usually is," Track chuckled, and followed me down. I actually made it all the way without any help, although I did have to take it slow and use my other 3 legs to bear most of the weight. When I got to the bottom, I walked over and hopped in the back of the closed car. Glad it was actually a car and lowered to the ground. Track and Jackson jumped in behind me, but my dad only leaned in and smiled at me. "I'll be staying back," he stated, and I turned around and looked up at him. "Picking up supplies and taking care of business," he winked. That was my dad. I barked at him and then looked at Track. "Tell him it's okay, and thank you, please." Track nodded and relayed the message. My dad rubbed between my ears and then shut the door. I looked over the seat and saw Michael and Martin's forms. We were still for a moment, and then someone gave us the all clear and we drove off slowly. The trip took less than a minute, and I paced until the massive doors to the hangar were sealed. Martin got out, and I jumped as soon as he opened our door. I gave myself a good hard shake and then bowed into a stretch that felt amazing. No stretching on 2 legs ever felt this good. Jackson bounced on his toes, and even Track looked a bit antsy. "Go ahead." We turned to see Ryan standing there, and the 2 sped off to find a place to shift. Our Alpha looked down at me. "Don't push it, pup. I see you limping too much, and right back you go." I flinched and snorted a nod, then turned and put my nose to the ground, walking faster as I inspected all the new smells. There had definitely been other wolves here, but that didn't surprise me, and no alarms went off. I quickly lost interest and then barked loudly when I saw 2 other wolves running towards me. I lowered my front half and bared my teeth, but my eyes were sparkling. The dark brown one barked, and the larger yellow one replied. I barked 2 more times, pulling back my teeth and forced my hackles up. I loved being a wolf. Inside voices. We all fluffed back up and looked to see Phil walking over. "This place is made of metal and echoes," he stated, and my ears dropped a little. "Actually, she's just fine and can make as much noise as she wants." Our 3 heads turned again, and we saw Jonathan, with Ryan and my guards stopping behind him. Okay, I was confused. Could we bark or couldn't we? Jonathan smiled, keeping his eyes on me. "This is Oliver Strip. He's a good friend of your father's." That name only slightly rang a bell. "This is a private airport, Raina," he shrugged. "Aside from some military and the occasional emergency landing, this is a non-human port, so yell away," he smiled, gesturing around. When my head only tilted, he nodded. "You can howl or bark, No one is going to quiet you here." He put a bit more emphasis on that last word, and my brows lowered. But Jackson threw back his head and tested the freedom. My throat tingled from the sound, and I lifted mine and joined him. Man, that felt incredible. In fact, it felt so good, I did it 2 more times. Any more than that, unless you're spreading information, is just overkill. I shook myself hard again, the adrenaline pumping through me. My front end lowered, and I was ready to lunge at Jackson, who was too busy sniffing a spot on the cement floor. "Anything but that," said a voice above a pair of black boots. I lifted my head, and Michael nodded down, looking at me. "No rough housing." "Fine, Mom," I shouted, turned and trotted off, flicking my tail at him. It was a bit childish, but I didn't care. Plus, it was quickly forgotten as I took a full lap around the enormous enclosure. The smells here weren't all that great, but they weren't horrible either. Some oil, some metal, the people that had come and gone recently, and a few other smells that didn't interest me. Track and Jackson were hard into the game of chase and pommel, but I was only slightly jealous and not willing to lose this bit of freedom. They would run over to me every now and then, check on me by nipping at me, and then turn and bolt off. Michael and Martin smiled at me when I passed them, and I barked a hello back. Ryan was sitting in a chair and would nod or wink. Phil sat next to him, and Jonathan was with my guards most of the time. Every once in a while he would step away with his phone to his ear. One time, when I trotted past the audience, I noticed he was gone. I looked around, but kept going and even galloped a bit. I felt the growl from across the arena and quickly slowed back to a trot. Fine. Fine. And that's where I'm going to end this.